The world is not going to be saved by legislation. William Howard Taft, 27th U.S. President. All right. Welcome to another morning episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. So today we're going to talk about the Trans-Easter Showdown that occurred over the weekend. Well, actually right before the weekend. But before we get to that, Mondays I'm kind of designating as my day to do a bill review. And when I say bill review, I'm kind of using that term loosely. Basically what I mean is any kind of like proclamation or declaration that comes from an elected official. So whether or not it's maybe an executive order or an actual bill, like like a Senate bill or a House bill, and that could be at the state level or the federal level, and sometimes I'll review like a bill that's at a city level. So I decided I was very curious, and I was like, I wonder how many bill reviews I've done up until this point. And so I literally went through all of my episodes because I don't really have, I haven't been keeping such good track outside, like in some sort of document somewhere and saying, like, all right, here's all the show notes and here's everything that I've done, and links to whatever. So I just kind of compiled this new list and I just literally clicked on every single one of, went through every single one of my episodes. There's like almost 300 of them. And it turns out I've done 50 bill reviews at least. Now, I might have missed a few just because maybe my show notes weren't always so good, in the background here. But it looks like I've done 50 bill reviews. So, like, I think that's pretty phenomenal for just some dude who's not a lawyer who has a podcast and he's like, look, I'm going to read these bills and just tell you about this. And sometimes I feel like I read more bills than our legislators, which is kind of weird. So I've done about 50 and it's covered 14 different states. And then also Congress. I've done some executive orders at the federal level and then also at the state level. By far, Florida, because I live in Florida, I've done by far the most with a total of, 20? So like almost half of my bill reviews have been from Florida. And I believe and I didn't get a chance to really take a look exactly at all the bills that I've supported, but um, I can think of 3 that I've actually supported out of like the 50 some, there might be a couple more, but out of the 50 some that I've done, I think I've supported like 3. And it's actually so few that I can remember which ones they are. So I recently, I think it was last week, I did the bill the bill on squatters here in Florida, how we have put into our law, where if you are a landlord and somebody is squatting in your house and they cannot provide, they cannot produce a document, and I believe it has to be notarized, a notarized document that says that they live, that this is their rental agreement. It has to be notarized, and if they can't, then you can actually have them removed. Now, there are provisions in there, like if you remove somebody, like if you take advantage of it, maybe somebody couldn't figure it out, or, they lost their paperwork, or, whatever. So there are provisions for, landlords who might take advantage of that. But the whole goal here is, like if you don't belong in a house, then the landlord or whoever owns the property should be able to remove you without a lot of delay. And so that's what the bill does. So I'm very much in support of that bill, because basically, just a rundown, I'm not going to go into the whole bill review. A rundown of it is that squatters are taking advantage of laws that are meant for to kind of keep order between tenants and landlords. And so, like, if I'm a landlord and I have a tenant, and then maybe I'm being a little bit on the abusive side, then there are laws that are supposed to help them. It's basically ensuring that I uphold my end of the contract, and that, that I'm doing things that are fair, and then also keeps them behaving fairly as well. And so what happens is squatters will get into a house and then they'll be like, oh, well, um, I live here, and here's my bill that I'm, paying for this or that. And of course, police officers, they don't know the difference. So they have to send it becomes a civil matter, right? So squatters are taking advantage of something that's legitimately there to kind of keep the contracts in smooth running order between a squatter and a rent. I'm sorry, between a renter and a landlord. So that one was one. Another one, and I think this was back in 20. I think these both might have been back in 2020. I can't remember exactly on both of them, because I didn't see them in my list. I know I supported them, so maybe I just made a tweet about it. I can't remember exactly. But I, one of them was I think it was Thomas Massey, who put forward a bill to end the Department of Education at the federal level, and I think it's like one sentence. Now, I think he's done it again. I think there's a new one. So I think after time, the bills kind of, I don't want to say fall off. That's not really like the legal term, but for lack of better phrasing, they basically fall off. Like, they come to their end. And so I think he's got a new one out now. But I supported that one, and it's literally one line. It's like, on this, after the date of signing, the Department of Education shall cease to exist, or something like that. It's like one sentence, and I'm like, okay, cool. The other one was from Rand Paul, and he put forward a bill that would end no knock raids. I mean, technically, it wouldn't end no knock raids. What it would do, it would actually be a good version of the government using money to kind of impose its will. So you can argue about that, but what the idea is that it would say, all right, well, if you want federal money for, and I don't remember specifically what it was tied to, but if you want this particular federal money, then you need to show that you are not that you have limited no knock raids, and if you haven't done that, then you don't get this money. That's basically what it is, and I supported that too, because I support the ending of no knock raids. So out of, like, say, some 50 bills that I've reviewed, like, three of them I've came out in full support of. Some of the other ones, maybe I supported the issue, like the whatever it was that was causing the issue, right, to be talked about. But I didn't necessarily, either I maybe disagreed with how the law was written and I thought it was too vague, or I didn't like some provisions in there, or in some other cases, I just said I agree that this is a problem, but I don't believe that a legal path, like, creating a new bill, new legislation, I don't believe that is our best answer in dealing with it. So, for example, um, here in Florida, everybody knows about all the so-called book bans, not technically book bans, actually, but what Florida did was they said, in order for a bill, bill, in order for a book to be permitted, it has to be reviewed by like and I can't remember what they called it, but they created some new position. It was like a media specialist or something like that. And so a media specialist would be the one that would go through and review a book and give it a stamp of approval. And if a book had not been given a stamp of approval, then the lingering question was, if it happens to be a book with inappropriate content that was given to a child, anybody in school, then the teacher or whomever it was that gave that presented the book, they could be liable. They could get punished for it. And so then, of course, teachers were freaking out and they're like, well, let me just pull all these books off the shelf because I don't know which ones. Right. And it was kind of an absurd one. So I believe that, yeah, there was a problem to be dealt with because you had all these parents. I mean, we saw the videos of all these parents that were, going before the school board and or either city council, and they would like pull out a book and they would start reading it. And they're like, this is what my child brought home. And they're like reading a book. And, the city council or the school board would be like, hey, 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 the language is not appropriate here. And they're like, well, if it's not appropriate here at city council where a whole bunch of adults are, then what makes it any more appropriate for my child to have access in the public school system? Right. And so there was an issue, but the issue was only like 5 or 6 books. It was like the same set of books over and over and over and over. And so I was like, well, it seems to me that if you like states have a Department of Education, so in Florida has one, and I'm like, can't they just send out a memo and say, all right, here are these 6 books that keep popping up as a problem that parents are, coming to school boards and, having a fit about. Let's deal with these books. Let's deal with these 5 or 6 books. And so I was like, I don't know that we need legislation that covers like every single book in every single public school here in Florida. That just seemed absurd to me. And then create new positions and have all this new bureaucracy and all this stuff. So it just seemed kind of absurd to me. So I was like, all right, well, there's a problem here to deal with, but is that really the right way to go about it? So this is why I do the bill reviews, right? Because like we want to make sure that when we support or oppose a bill, we know what the bill is actually talking about. Maybe we've had some discussion on what are the potential impacts of the bill. Maybe the language is written kind of vaguely, and so it could create more problems than it solves. Maybe it doesn't even need to be legislated, right? Maybe we can say, look, yeah, that is a problem, but there are other ways of addressing it that don't require legislation. And that's kind of what I mean when I pull that quote out from Taft. The world is not going to be saved by legislation. Like legislation is not the answer to everything. I would argue in most cases, it's really not the answer to anything. I mean, out of like 50 bills, I've supported like 3 of them, and 2 of them were to get rid of things, right? Like only one actually imposed any kind of penalty or limitation on the people that it governed. And in a sense, it really didn't even do that. It just supported the rights of property owners. So it kind of put a limitation on squatters, but you could kind of argue that it's not really a limitation, that it's really ensuring property rights for property owners. Apologies, folks. I seem to be running like I don't know, maybe pollen has fallen again, and like it's just agitating my throat and my nasal passages. So dealing with that again. So joy. So anyway, I thought that was kind of cool. Like I was, going through it, and I was kind of hoping it would be more. I was, after several years of podcasting, it's kind of like, man, I hope there's like 60 or 70 or 80, close to 100. So clearly I need to make sure that I do more bill reviews. And so if you have any ideas on bills that you would like me to do a bill, just send me a message. You can find me on Twitter. I'm kind of sometimes on Facebook. I'm not probably not there as much. Throw a comment in, be like, hey, you know what, this bill review is all right, but I'd really like to see you do a bill review on this one. Make sure you tell me the number and the state, or what give me a link would be the best. And I would love to read them. Like I know it sounds weird, but I try to like I find it interesting to go to the source material and determine for myself whether or not I agree with how it's being talked about. And I'm going to try to start doing some more reviews on like studies and stuff like that. We did one, myself and Kyle Matovic did one just last Friday. And it wasn't really a study so much. It was just more like a presentation about a study. So the study details weren't quite like they put out some of the details, but it was more of a presentation at a conference, and it generated some headlines. And so we started talking about it, and we kind of went through the presentation because I was able to dig up the presentation. And so these are the kind of things that I think are a value add, because the more that we know about, legislation and studies, the better that we can make decisions. And, one of the frustrating things I find is that sometimes it's hard to find them, right? Like I think it was like the "Don't Say Gay" bill here in Florida when it was in full swing. I remember I kind of struggled when I was going through the news headlines, trying to find, okay, what's the bill number so that I can find the actual bill and read it myself. And, sometimes it can be very difficult because people just want to, use buzzwords, and that wasn't even the name of the bill, like not the technical name. So it's not even like I could go to the Florida legislature website and type in "Don't Say Gay" bill, because that's not what it was named. That was just like the nickname that I got in the media. And when we read these things, then we can decide, do we support it or do we not support it? And we can become more informed. And that's the idea behind the show, is that I want people to be more informed so that we can make better decisions and criticize our government and our leaders where appropriate. Because some issues, maybe they do need criticized, but maybe it's the item that we've specifically chosen is not really where our criticism needs to be. And how do we get better? How do we get a better society if we're criticizing the wrong things? Right. And we see this, like, I feel like I see this on the internet a lot, like on social media. People just criticize stuff and they just throw out stuff and it becomes a big thing. And then you start digging in, you're like, okay, there was room to criticize here, but maybe that wasn't the correct criticism that we should have really been focusing on. So, for instance, this last weekend, there was this whole big to do about the Trans Day of Visibility and Easter. And it got me, right? Like I was, I was part of the crowd that was misinformed. And, like I didn't say anything crazy, but like, at least not on social media, but I did come out and like, I'll tell you what I said about it. Um, my first, let's see, where is it? I'm just going to read it. I'm not going to put it up on the screen here. So let's see here. There it is. I said, "What a great way to sow division and later sympathize with hate that you caused. If the trans community were serious about being accepted, they'd reject this on the grounds that it unnecessarily takes overshadows. I gotta work on my editing skills, but that it unnecessarily overshadows the faith of their fellow Americans. But don't hold your breath." And that was in response to this proclamation on Transgender Day of Visibility 2024 by President Biden. So what's going on here is a lot of it came out as this proclamation, and it was like, "Whoa, you trying to cancel Easter?" And that's where a lot of people went with it, and like that's where I went with it. And somebody, I didn't get too many responses. One person was like, "Oh, it's always March 31, dipshit." That's what they said to me, and I was like, "Oh, okay." So I went and looked into it, and I was like, "Oh, okay. It looks like it has been March 31st for quite a while now, since actually 2009." And so then I realized, I was like, "Okay, well, that's not like, you didn't help the situation, right? Like, yeah, I got it wrong, right? Like, it wasn't a slight against Easter intentionally, right? Like, that's not what was necessarily happening." And so I retweeted this person and I said, "Well, what you could have said was something like this: Hey, man, it's always March 31st, but I understand forgetting as dates are commonly forgotten. Biden did a disservice to America by not mentioning Easter or Christians or trying to use this as an opportunity to bridge divides. But hey, you got your insult in, and that's what counts." And I hold to that. Like, like that's what counts. You got your insult. A lot of people were just going back and forth. It was like, oh, you had the religious community, and they were up in arms, and they're like, "Oh, you're trying to cancel Easter. I can't believe you did this." Yada yada yada. And then you had all the trans folk, the trans allies, if you will, and they were like, "Oh, you bunch of idiots. I can't believe how stupid you are. It's always on March 31st." And I'm like, okay, well, look, like I remember my wife's birthday and I remember my son's birthday. And when my mom was alive, I would sometimes remember my mom's birthday, but I wasn't always so good at it, right? My dad would be like, "Hey, your mom's birthday is coming up," right? So I want you to think about it. Like, how many dates do people in general remember? Well, we actually probably forget a lot more than we remember of day-to-day things that are, like, really close and important, right? Like, I mean, how many jokes have you seen about a husband who, forgot about his wife's birthday, right? Something like that. And, like, we're just not a society that necessarily remembers dates for specific things necessarily, unless it's just a huge thing, like July 4th, Christmas, those kind of things. We will remember those dates because I'm 45. I've been celebrating or participating in some way in the celebration of Christmas for 45 years. And it's every year on the same day. And it's a huge thing. Like, you can't miss it. Like, in, like, what, September, they're putting out Christmas, stuff. So, I think we need to start, looking at these kind of things and say, okay, well, was it reasonable for people to not know this? And I think the answer is yes, right? It was reasonable for people not know this. And the other thing is, it's a proclamation. So think about it for a second. We don't have, like, I've seen some people that try to, like, narrow down. They're like, okay, well, if you look at this word here, this, like, I don't think we really need to get all nitty gritty and try to weasel our way out through words. Just make it simple. Look, people forget dates. You see that the president put out a proclamation for a Trans Day of Visibility. Trans issues are pretty hot button right now, regardless of what side you're on. They're a hot button. And Easter is a huge holiday. Huge. A lot of people celebrate it, right? And so when you put all that together in a bucket, you can see where people are going to start taking things like, wait a minute, proclamation. What about Easter? Right. And so it makes sense. So let me read from an article here. And this comes from the uh, where does it come from? The Hill. So we'll read about it, and then we're actually, it's not up on the screen. Where'd you go? Let's see here. There you go. Perfect. All right. So here's what Trump and Biden said in their Easter messages. And so this was yesterday. President Biden and former President Trump shared starkly different Easter messages Sunday. Biden marked the holy day with a solemn message, while Trump lashed out at political opponents in an all caps post on Truth Social. Just like an old person. Sorry. I mean, all caps, really? Like, come on, man. Like, nobody uses all caps anymore. President Trump, stop it. Like, that's just absurd. Anyway, Trump went after prosecutors, blah, blah. I don't care about that. Biden, a devout Catholic, marked Easter with the reminders of the story of Jesus' sacrifice with blessings. Let's see here. We're going down. Trump's political message comes after conservatives lashed out against Biden for acknowledging Transgender Day of Visibility on Sunday. Transgender Day of Visibility is marked on March 31 every year, with Biden making a proclamation to recognize the date every year. This year, out of coincidence, and this is true, it aligns with Easter. It's true. Um, Biden's acknowledgement of the day caused a backlash with the Trump campaign speaker Mike Johnson and other conservatives, implying that is in some way a slight to Easter itself. The White House also pushed back on the criticism Saturday, noting that Biden himself is quite religious. As a Christian who celebrates Easter with family, President Biden stands for bringing people together and upholding the dignity and freedoms of every American, spokesperson Andrew Bates said in a statement to multiple outlets. Sadly, it's unsurprising. Politicians are seeking to divide and weaken our country with cruel, hateful, and dishonest rhetoric. Being surprised? Is anybody really surprised? It doesn't matter who is in office, right? Like, we're all like, this is these are the politicians that we have asked for. It doesn't matter what side you're on, right? You can be a supporter of Trump, you can be a supporter of Biden. We have overall, we have asked for this. We have said, go out there and try to dunk on the other guy, the other team. Like, that's what we've asked for. So we really shouldn't be surprised when the other team dunks on us, whether or not the dunk even makes sense. Transgender Day of Visibility. Oh, well, President Biden will never abuse his faith for political purposes or for profit. I mean, I doubt that. I mean, sorry, this is not a slight against President Biden. I'm not like, oh man, that Biden guy's he's a politician. And I think politicians, especially the longer you're there, the more likely, you are going to abuse your faith or anything for political purpose or profit. Like that's basically what a politician does, because that's what we as a country have asked for, right? We're like, go get them. However you do it, go get them. We're not really asking for honesty, and we need to, right? Like that's kind of what this show is about. Like, we want to talk about these things, and we want to talk about them and say, like, let's have an honest conversation here, and so that we know what we need to criticize. So we're going to come back to the issue of this Trans Day of Visibility and Easter, but first, in the effort to make sure that everybody is aware of what the Trans Day of Visibility is meant for, I found a video. It was hard to find a video because once you see these controversies, like every video you see is about the controversy, and I'm like, all right, let me find a video that kind of gives me the details in a more neutral fashion. And that can be sometimes tough. But as your great host of this episode podcast, I have managed to find a video that I think is very fair. So if you are somebody who is really opposed to trans issues, I think you'll have to admit that this is a fair video. It's not very long; it's like 2 minutes. And if you're somebody who's very supportive of trans issues, then I think you'll also say, yes, DL, that was a totally fair interpretation of what the Trans Day of Visibility is. So let's play that video, and then we're going to talk about how this squares away with Easter and all of our politicians. Here we go.
Historically, the LGBTQ community has fallen victim to violence and discrimination, which has made finding outlets for joy and celebration a necessity. For Rachel Crandall Crocker, this was the case after she realized that the only trans-centered day in the US, Transgender Day of Remembrance, didn't offer opportunities to celebrate. Instead, the day was often commemorated with community memorials, an opportunity to honor trans individuals who had lost their lives in recent years. In 2009, Crandall Crocker decided that it was time not only to remember the dead, but also to celebrate the living. And so began her mission of making the day a reality. Crandall Crocker settled on March 31st, a date far enough away to make it distinct from Pride Month and Transgender Day of Remembrance, as the official date for Transgender Day of Visibility. Since its first celebration in 2009, Transgender Day of Visibility has gained massive traction, not only in the United States, but in other countries as well. In 2021, U.S. President Joe Biden officially proclaimed March 31st Transgender Day of Visibility. He was the first U.S. president to do so.
To everyone celebrating Transgender Day of Visibility, I want you to know that your president sees you, and we're committed to advancing transgender equality in the classroom, on the playing field, at work, in our military, in our housing and healthcare systems, everywhere, simply everywhere.
Even with a national proclamation of the special holiday, legislators across the United States have filed hundreds of anti-LGBTQ bills. Clearly, there is still much work to be done in guaranteeing that trans voices are heard and protected. And many believe that providing opportunities for visibility is the first step in a greater movement toward equality and equity.
All right. So that came from Britannica. And I think it's a very fair description of the Trans Day of Visibility. Now, the things that I wanted to focus on, number one, Trans Day of Visibility started in 2009. Okay. So it's quite a bit, it's over a decade old. Okay. Now, we didn't start seeing proclamations from our president until Joe Biden got into office in 2021. So this will be part of the reason why people didn't remember this. And this is what I mean. Like when we start understanding these facts, then we start recognizing like, oh, why did people? Well, when you make a proclamation and it happens to be on Easter, and we're not used to seeing proclamations, right? And we don't really remember dates so well, um, then it makes sense that our first instinct is to say, whoa, dude, like seriously, you're gonna overshadow Easter by this holiday? You just because it kind of felt like, man, you just started this brand new thing on Easter. Are you crazy? Right. And here's the thing. If presidents were not accustomed to doing this kind of a thing, regardless of what side they're on, it might give us pause more. You think about that for a second. We, like a lot of people were immediately like, oh, why would the president do that? But those same people weren't like, wait a minute, I don't even like that president, but that really doesn't sound like him. Right? Like this is what I mean. Like we need to generate a better society by holding our leaders accountable for more important things. And the longer we don't, the more likely we're going to be easily duped by something dumb in the future. I mean, think about it. Like, how many people didn't immediately say, hey, wait a minute, that is because I know people that I've heard claims about, and maybe I'm not a big fan of them. And the moment that a claim comes out about, some person, and I'm like, wait a minute, I, that doesn't sound like that person. Like 'cause we have a sense for who a person is. The longer that we've been exposed to them, whether it's in person or at least through a president or some other politician. So we kind of get to know people by a reputation. And right now, the reputation is that politicians do whatever they need to do. Um, to get elected, to secure votes, to get, money from different organizations, to satisfy whatever. Like, so that's like we're not really accustomed to a leader coming out and saying like, "Hey, um, I'm doing this thing, and I'm also not forgetting other Americans in the process." Right? We're more used to this idea of who can we get our leaders to support, and as long as we get them to support our group, then many of us, unfortunately, are happy. Like, oh, they talked about us. Yeah. Right. And like, there's no regard for anything else. And that's our problem. We have created this problem. Right. And politicians are more than happy to oblige because they want to get elected and reelected. Right. And they want their team to win. And they want to be able to dunk on our team, whatever that team is. And so we as Americans have caused this because we go after dumb stuff. Like this was dumb at the end of the day. This idea that they were trying to overshadow Easter holiday, which would have been a big deal had it been true, but it wasn't true. Okay. So let's take a look at the actual proclamation that was made. And I'm just going to kind of read through it. We're not going to, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. So I'm not going to like go through every single word or whatever, but we are going to take a peek at it because it's a big deal. And we want to look at it and we want to have a better understanding of the issues around us so that we can better, insist on what we want the public servants to focus on, how we want them to focus on it, and then maybe how we engage each other on these topics because they're not going away, right? Like I get it. These issues are like in some ways some people would say, well, that's a dumb issue. It is, but if it gets momentum and it causes legislation, then it wasn't a dumb issue, right? It was an important issue for somebody, and that legislation is potentially going to do something good or bad. And in my opinion, usually bad, right? Like I don't generally look at legislation and say, oh yeah, well, that's going to make society better. I think that the more that we add to legislation, the more that we add to executive orders and proclamations and all these other things, the more that we add to those, all we're doing is fueling this fire because it's just a big fight to get leadership to validate our ideas publicly. And I think that's what I think that's what ends up being a lot of showdown, right? And just to kind of take it on a tangent here, even in the libertarian community, like there'll be somebody, that's really popular, and they're like a voice that a lot of people hear, and everybody gets mad at the person. Like, well, you need to talk about this. It's like all you're trying to do is get someone who's important, if you will, to validate your ideas. And the more that we play that game, the less that we'll actually get, because it's just a fight for somebody's attention. That's all it is. It's like little kids fighting and going to, like, Mom, am I the best or is Johnny the best? Right. And trying to get your mom to say that you're the best instead of Johnny, your brother, or whoever. Right. And, and I feel like that's kind of what we're doing. So the show here is to try to talk about these issues and say, all right, like where is the appropriate conversation to be had on this matter? So let's take a look, and we're just going to kind of go through it real quickly. All right, there we are. And let's see. Proclamation on Transgender Day of Visibility 2024. And I want you to keep in mind the video that we just watched, okay, which I think is very fair. And I think that pro-trans folk will say, like, yes, that was a good video. I appreciate that video, okay? So we start off and we say, on Transgender Day of Visibility, we honor the extraordinary courage and contributions of transgender Americans and reaffirm our nation's commitment to forming a more perfect union where all people are created equal and treated equally throughout their lives. Okay, fine. I don't really have a big issue here. Like, and I think that kind of matches up with what they were saying in the video. Like, this person Crockett or whoever it was, whoever it was that created the Trans Day of Visibility, which was, let me look at this other note that I have. It's Rachel Crandall Crocker, right? So whoever that is, they created it, and what they did was they said, I wanted it to be far away from when we celebrate Pride, and then when we celebrate the Trans Day of Remembrance for those who have died, whether it was suicide or violence, right? And so they want to celebrate people. So that matches up. I'm proud of that. My administration has stood for justice from the start. Okay. So see, this is what I mean. Like, we're not really being honest. Like you might have, you might want to make this claim about some minority groups, but I don't really think the administration has really stood for justice. That's a whole nother conversation. But anyway, working to ensure that the LGBTQI plus, I swear to God, if you guys add any more letters to that, I'm just going to stop saying it. Community can live openly in safety with dignity and respect. I'm proud to have appointed transgender leaders to my administration and to have ended the ban on transgender Americans serving openly in our military. I'm proud to have signed historic executive orders that strengthen civil rights, protections in housing, employment, healthcare, education, the justice system, and more. I'm proud to have signed the Respect for Marriage Act into law, ensuring that every American can marry the person that they love. Okay, fine. Transgender Americans are part of the fabric of our nation. Whether serving their communities or in the military, raising families, or running businesses, they help America thrive. They deserve and are entitled to the same rights and freedoms as every other American, including the most fundamental freedom to be their true selves. Okay, so first and foremost on this, there is no fundamental freedom to be yourself. That is not a fundamental freedom, right? Like, there doesn't exist for me, and it doesn't exist for anyone else. Now, you do have this fundamental right to, because you own your body, you have this fundamental right to do what you want and to pursue happiness, right? Like, if you had said pursue happiness, I think that would have been more appropriate. But there is no, because, like, I don't even know what that means to be your true self. Like, what if I'm a jerk? What if my true self is being a jerk? Do I have a fundamental freedom to be my true self, to be a jerk to people? Would we say that's what America is all about? That doesn't make any sense. So I actually disagree with this. And I just think that, like, you have the fundamental freedom to do as you choose, so long as it's not violating somebody else's. But it's the foundation of our government wasn't about being your true self. It was about living your life without government interference. Here's where we start getting into things. But extremists are proposing hundreds of hateful laws that target and terrify transgender kids and their families, silencing teachers, banning books, and even threatening parents, doctors, and nurses with prison for helping parents get care for their children. So remember, Transgender Day of Visibility was supposed to be about celebrating the contributions of people, right? And he says that up at the very beginning, where was it here? Excuse me. Where to go here? Oh yeah, we're part of our fabric of our nation, serving in our communities, military, raising families, running businesses, helping America thrive. So you say all that, and then you dive into it, and you're like, all right, well, now we've got these extremists that are proposing hundreds of hateful laws that target and terrify transgender kids and their families, silence teachers. It's going on. These bills attack our most basic American values, the freedom to be yourself. Again, not a freedom necessarily. I mean, that may be the result of the freedoms that we have, but that is in itself not the core fundamental purpose of those freedoms. The freedom to make your own healthcare decisions. Again, it's broader than that. It's not specific. And even the right to raise your own child. Again, broader than these things. So he's narrowing it down. And so the problem that I have here is now we're getting into this divisive part, right? We're coming up to Easter, where people are celebrating their religious beliefs and, the resurrection of Christ and, what that means in salvation, people. And for me, when I think about these religious holidays, they generally coincide with this idea of being a better person in general, right? And making sure that you forgive people and be more, listen to them more. And so now we're getting into we're attacking people. So now it's not about just celebrating the good things that people done, because you can celebrate things and you can say, hey, you know what? Like, if you feel it's necessary, and I'm trying to take an agnostic stance here for the purposes of the show. I don't really think that these kind of proclamations are even necessary. But let's say you did, and then you're like, I want to celebrate the good things that transgender people. Well, then maybe focus on that. Don't immediately launch into going about and like, oh, there's hateful this and legislation and extremists, and you're using all this very strong language, right? Um, and then it's like, it is no surprise that the bullying and discrimination that transgender Americans face is worsening our nation's mental health crisis, leading half of transgender youth to consider suicide in the past year. At the same time, an epidemic against transgender women and girls, especially women and girls of color, continues to take too many lives. Let me be clear. All of these attacks are un-American and must end. No one should have to be brave just to be themselves. So again, there's this whole paragraph is about the negative things that they've faced. So we're now not talking about, again, the contributions. In fact, keep waiting for the contribution that he talks about. At the same time, my administration is working to stop the bullying and harassment of transgender children and their families. The Department of Justice has taken action to push back against extreme and un-American state laws targeting transgender youth and their families. And the Department of Justice is partnering with law enforcement and community groups to combat hate and violence. My administration is also providing dedicated emergency mental health support through our nationwide suicide and crisis lifeline. Any LGBTQI plus young person in need can call 988 and press 3 to speak with a counselor trained to support them. We are making public services more accessible for transgender Americans, including with more inclusive passports and easier access to Social Security benefits. There's much more to do. I continue to call on Congress to pass the Equality Act to codify civil rights protections for all LGBTQI plus Americans. Today, we send a message to all transgender Americans. You are loved, you are heard, you are understood, you belong, you are America, and my entire administration, and I have your back. Now, therefore, I, Joseph R. Biden Jr., President of the United States, by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Constitution and the laws of the United States, do hereby proclaim March 31, 2024 as Transgender Day of Visibility. I call upon Americans to join us in lifting up the lives and voices of transgender people throughout our nation and to work toward eliminating violence and discrimination based on gender identity. In witness thereof, I have hereunto set my hand this 29th day of March in the year of our Lord 2024 and of the independence of the United States of America, the 248th. Joseph R. Biden. So Remember when I said just a moment ago, like, wait for all the contributions that you want to talk? He didn't talk about any. Like, there's not a single one in here, right? But in the video that we watched, and when you go back and you look, the whole point of Transgender Day of Visibility is to celebrate things. That was its supposed purpose. But like half of this proclamation is just talking about all the negative things. So we're not actually celebrating anything, right? We didn't identify anything. He did nothing. So this is what I mean. Like, what's the criticism that we should have? Should it be really that he made a proclamation for the Transgender Day of Visibility being on March 31st, which also happened to fall on Easter Sunday in 2024? No, we should not have. And for the people that did, for those who knew what the day, the distinction, they should have come along and said, "Oh man, check it out. Look, I hear what you're saying. No, that's actually not the case. I get you. I hear, you would be upset by that. And, and I can totally understand why you'd be because the opposite would be true, right? Imagine that you have like, it's March 31st. So imagine if President Biden said nothing, made a proclamation about Easter and said nothing about the trans folk. Well, they would be angry. They'd be like, "Hey, well, you forgot about us. This is our day of visibility, and you didn't even mention us, right?" And so I think critics of everybody that freaked out unnecessarily, they're forgetting they would have been equally angry as well had the tables been turned, right? Had it looked like the president was, favoring one group over another, which is basically what the core of the issue was. But that wasn't the issue because again, that's not what the president was doing. He wasn't overshadowing it. And some would argue and say, well, he made the proclamation a couple of days early in order to kind of keep a distinction between Easter. And I don't know if that's true or not, whatever the case is. The fact of the matter is, I think the real argument here is twofold. Number one, if you're going to say this proclamation is for a day to remember the good things of people, then keep focused on the good things of people. You can talk about any alleged violence and, mental health and other concerns at a later point. It's not appropriate to talk about them then because you just said you're trying to celebrate things. So then celebrate. Are we supposed to celebrate all those negative things? I mean, let's go back down and take a look at it, right? Like, let's go down here. Where is it? Let's see. Bullying, harassment, extreme laws, which I don't necessarily agree with. I mean, kind of, sort of, but not really. I mean, everybody's passing extreme laws, like so, like whatever, like honestly, let's put it this way. Maybe you're not a real American until somebody wants to pass a law that negatively affects you, because it doesn't matter who you are. Somebody has passed a law to their benefit and not to yours. Doesn't matter what group you're in. So if you've never had one, maybe that's the mark of like, hey, I'm not a real American until somebody tries to pass a law that impacts me negatively. That's when I become a real American because by golly, that's what a lot of legislation does. Right. So I don't like this idea of like extremists are proposing hundreds of hateful laws. Um, well, that fails to recognize that these laws came about because people had concerns that we're busy fighting over and not addressing in a better way. Like, some of those transgender laws, I've opposed them because I didn't like the language of them, but I recognize that, hey, there is a problem that does need to be dealt with here. But I don't know that legislation is the right path for it. Or I don't know that the way this bill is written will actually do it. I mean, how many times have we seen laws that do the exact opposite of what they say? Right. So I don't know that, I don't know that we can anymore say that all these laws that are being proposed are absolutely just pure hateful by extremists when one, it happens to virtually everybody else, just different shoe. Right. And then number two, when like there are real problems that do need to be addressed and maybe we're just going about it the wrong way. So but again, this is a very divisive message. So this is not celebrating anybody. And if you're telling me that this is a day to celebrate, then tell me something I should celebrate. Like when we do Black History Month, what do? We're like, oh, Martin Luther King, Bessie Coleman, Frederick Douglass. We're talking like, all these people, Walter Williams, like to name more recent people, right? Thomas Sowell. Like, we put up Black individuals that have done great things and say, check out this person and what they do, right? Like, that's because what we're trying to do is we're trying to raise the profile of the Black community in a sense by saying, like, here are some achievements to talk about. That doesn't mean that we don't necessarily talk about some of the negative things, but it would be it's weird in any other context to say, I'm going to imagine I'm celebrating my birthday and then I talk about all the other days of my life, of the year that were terrible. And how, I'm really glad to celebrate my birthday, but man, I tell you what, it sucked this and this sucked that, like, no, if you're going to celebrate, then celebrate and tell me things that we need to celebrate about. Tell me good things, tell me positive things. And if there are none, well, then maybe you don't need a day to celebrate because you haven't got there yet. Right. And this is the kind of stuff that we need to be holding our leadership accountable for. Now, back to Easter. Let's talk about Easter and how this ties in a little bit. So, a moment ago, I read that tweet of mine where I said, let me read it again here, where I was criticizing how that person responded to me, right? And I said, um, I said Biden did a disservice to America by not mentioning Easter or Christians or trying to use this as an opportunity to bridge divides. Now, he probably would have gotten in trouble for that because that's where we are as a society, right? If he had tried to say something like, very, very neutral, like, hey, this is Easter. A lot of you are spending time with your families. You're heading to church. You're thinking a little bit more about your religious beliefs. This is a good time to reflect on other Americans, some of whom are transgender because we happen to have this day of transgender visibility that's coming up as well. And I want to just take this time to ask my fellow Americans just to think, about your faith and about how maybe we as a country can come together and be a little bit more united, right? What kind of things in your faith can you do to help your fellow Americans feel a little bit more like a united American with you? You may disagree with them, and that's fine. But take this opportunity to think about your faith and reflect on how that impacts your engagement with your neighbor, right? Something along that line. Like, I'm just kind of doing it off the cuff, so I don't know that I've got a great message, but he's got speechwriters and they can sit down and do these kind of things. To me, that's what he should have done. He should have taken the opportunity to try to bridge a little bit, but instead he overshadows the whole point of it by talking about all these negative things. And then, people leap and they were like, oh, we're trying to replace Easter. Well, that's not really what it was doing. So there's guilt to go all around. Like if you're pointing a finger at somebody, in this particular case, it's very much true. There are three pointing back at you, like that dumb saying that we all heard as a kid. Well, that's the case. That's what we had happen this weekend. And so rather than using a religious observance to maybe bridge divides with people, we instead used it as an opportunity to fight each other again, right? And our politicians did us no favors by obliging, and both sides did it, right? Biden neglected things, and Trump went on the attack. And no leaders came out and said, hey, maybe we're all going about this wrong. Maybe there was a better way to approach this in the first place. But no, we just all fought about it. Went to Easter, and a lot of us pretended. I'm not, I mean, I go to church on a regular basis because my wife goes, and she's Catholic. I'm not. I'm just heathen, if you will. But a lot, when I was an evangelical, there was the running joke that everybody put on a smile before you get into church because the family had been fighting on the way to church, right? Well, I feel like that's what America was doing. Like, America, instead of taking this opportunity to really think about how we engage with each other, we instead got into all these big fights with each other. And and what was the point of our religious views? Why bother? Why bother having a faith if it doesn't impact your neighbor positively? Yay, you get to go to heaven. And along the way, you're a jerk to people. Whoop-de-doo, right? And the same criticism goes the other way, right? For the non-religious. Like, oh, yay, you get to talk about the Trans Day of Visibility. Yay, but it didn't really you didn't do anything to bridge the divides. You didn't really do anything to help. Like, here you are complaining that there's all this bullying and you exacerbate the problem by criticizing. And I saw some pretty mean things that people were saying, like, I am celebrating. I don't celebrate Easter. I'm celebrating the Trans Day of Visibility because, I love like, I saw people saying stuff like that. Like, okay, well, you are no better, right? So now you have these people, this trans group of people who are allegedly being bullied left and right, and nobody on either side, allies included, nobody thought, how do we bridge divides and maybe use this as an opportunity to do it? Nope, we all just fought, whatever. It's early. Give me a break. We all just kind of fight about it, and I participated a little bit. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, I don't think I was nearly as bad. I mean, so I guess you could say my sin was a little bit less, but it was there, because I initially came out and I was like, oh man, it looks like the president, you know, I think I was going in a little bit better direction, but again, and part of it was because I just didn't realize it. And then when some snotty people came along and they were like, "Oh, it's March 31st, you dummy," I was like, "Oh, well, screw you too," right? Like, so I wasn't any better. So all of this that I'm saying applies to me just as well as it does anybody else. The only difference between me and everybody else is I thought about it. I was like, what did we miss? All of us, what did we miss? We missed an opportunity to improve our relationships with other people that we may not have good relationships with. And that's what makes a healthy society. That's what stops bullying. That's what stops the quote unquote extremist laws. If we learn to live comfortably with each other in the first place, then we don't need to pass laws, right? In most cases. I mean, there might be some things that we disagree on, right? And we can have those debates, but maybe we can have those debates just a little bit more honestly. So that's my show today. Like, criticizing me and everyone else for how we behaved on Easter. So hopefully the next major religious holiday, we will get it right. Right. Hopefully, whichever one, whatever faith you are, whatever next holiday that you have, or major thing that, maybe it's not a major holiday per se, whatever the next one is, maybe we will take that opportunity and say, let me put out an olive branch, so to speak. And let me see if I can't bridge the divide just a little bit. Because if 300 million Americans, like 280 million Americans that are adults, something like that, if, or maybe it was 220, I can't remember the exact, it's like 220 million adult Americans. If 220 million Americans, if they make the slightest effort to improve just one person's day, I think that will go a long way for having a better country in just all areas, right? Not just trans issues, gay issues, Christian issues, Jewish issues. I mean, everybody's fighting and everybody's got a beef with somebody, right? I mean, we had all this legislation, like we need to deal with anti-Semitism. We've had COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, that was on the basis of Asian Americans. We've had, what, like, there's just like left and right. There's a constant conflict, and we may be addicted to it. And the only way that we can get ourselves unaddicted to it is if we start standing up and saying, all right, this moment right here, we're going to figure out how to get away from the conflict model. At least for one day, right? Tomorrow we'll go back fighting each other. But for today, we're going to try it out. We're going to give it a shot. Good old college try. And then tomorrow we'll go back to fighting. And then the next holiday, we'll do it again, right? And we just keep trying to improve and make one more day of not fighting with our fellow Americans. Because if we ever want to get anywhere, like we want to have, whatever utopia society that we all think we can have, that's the path. The path isn't through legislation, and it's not through proclamations, executive orders, because all of our leaders, all they're doing is obliging in what we as a society are doing. That's it. And we saw it. We saw Trump do it, right? He does it all the time, right? And I get it. We enjoy it. And to some degree, maybe it's fair. I'm not saying like none of it's ever fair, but maybe maybe we just start thinking about things differently. All right. Let's wrap up the show. Let's see what we got here. We've got some comments here. Let's take a look. Let's see here. Brian says, "What a waste of time and brain power." I agree. Hopefully he didn't mean the show. But I do agree. It is like a lot of this is a waste of time and brain power. But unfortunately, we need to put in that waste of time or that time of brain power, right? So that maybe we can start rethinking about how we do things and do things differently. Let's see what we got here. Happy Easter, time surfing alien. And belated Easter now. But yes, happy Easter to all. Let's see here. What do we got here? I'm looking for, just kind of scrolling through here. I thought I saw a comment that I was going to bring up. Where's this one? Preacher brother. I'm trying. This is my pulpit. This is where I preach, right? The good word, hopefully. So, all right, folks. Thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it, found it informative and inspiring. I hope that you'll try just a little bit harder to be a little bit nicer to somebody and try to give them a little bit more grace, because the more that we give grace, the more that we can hope to have grace given to us, right? And, like this weekend, I got it wrong. Some of my friends were polite and pointed it out, and they were like, "Hey, DL, turns out this has actually been going around for quite a while, over a decade old. So it's not really new. You don't have to, you don't have to freak out like everybody else." And they gave me grace, and I can appreciate it. And hopefully I will give somebody else grace, and then we can kind of pay it forward. Be sure to catch me Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Eastern, for an informed discussion on politics and culture. Be sure that you are subscribed to my YouTube channel, or if you prefer, my Rumble channel. You can go to youtube.libertydad.com. You can go to rumble.libertydad.com. While you're there, if you're watching later, let me know how I'm doing. Drop me a comment and be like, "Hey, DL, good job." Or, "Hey, DL, you know what? I don't know. You could probably improve in this way." That's cool. I'll take the tips. If you have a bill, any bill or executive order or a proclamation or anything that you think I should address, it doesn't matter where it's from. It doesn't have to be Florida. It could be it could be Florida. It could be Wyoming. It could be California, New York, whatever. It could be the at Congress, federal level. Let me know, and I'll take a look into it, and we'll see. So, but for now, I want you to remember that if you are a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. For now, catch you, tongue tied. Catch you next time. But for now, I'm out.